Okay, ladies and gentlemen, 30 seconds. Talk fast because we're finish the sentences. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to the workshop being held by the Council of the Corporation of the Municipality of Kincardine, 5 o'clock on September 11th, 2023. A day to remember, certainly. The council workshop was called per section 12.2 of the procedure bylaw for a community development workshop. So having said that, as we are in a workshop, there'll be no decisions made at this evening's meeting. Any matter requiring a decision shall be reported back to council for consideration and approval. A record describing in general terms the proceedings and the subject matter will be made and placed on a future council agenda to be received for information only. So I'd like to begin tonight, and it is a very appropriate beginning for this workshop on land use planning. I'd like to begin by commenting that we're holding our council meeting on lands and by the waters that we acknowledge are the traditional lands and treaty territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, which includes the Chippewas of Nawash unceded First Nation and the Chippewas of Saugeen First Nation, whose ancestors were among the first to inhabit, care for, and live on this land. And as I was thinking through the meeting this evening, I was pondering a little bit about what land use would look like when these early inhabitants of our land was here. And they, like we, had a place where they had winter campgrounds. They had lands that they used for hunting. They had lands used for planting. They were the very first land use planners. And hopefully tonight we'll honor that tradition as we listen and learn. We're committed to actions that move us toward a journey of truth, healing, and reconciliation with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, the Métis Nation of Ontario, and the historic Saugeen Métis. I'd like to ask any councillor to disclose pecuniary interest in the general nature thereof, either now as it arises in the meeting. All right. Land use planning is the effective, logical, compatible, and future use of the land that is under our purview these days. And land use determines and affects our budget, affects our staffing, it affects our opportunities for both council and staff, but also the residents' opportunity to work, play, live. That affords the amenities and the quality of life here in the municipality. Tonight, we're having the first of the next 25 years of increased attention to land use planning. This is not a one of, and that's all. In fact, the next land use planning meeting is already being planned pre-budget. So I'd like to extend a thanks to our staff for planning it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks to council for attending and offering your valued opinions on how our municipality will grow and prosper. And I'd like to thank the guests that are here tonight too, the presenters that will share their wisdom and guide us as we become more attuned to the land use demands and pressures that we will be facing inevitably. So with that, I will turn the evening next over to our CAO, Jolene Belchamber-Glazier, to welcome members and present an overview of the workshop.
Thank you, Mayor Craig. So Jen, if I could ask you to skip to the overview. We have planned a couple of hours for you to listen and learn and talk with one another. So we will try to keep it speedy because we've jammed a lot into this agenda, but we're really excited to hear from our speakers and as well hear from you and hear the feedback of it. You'll note that there are some sheets at your table that allow for you to take some notes. So we've prompted a few questions in this. If you can make note of things that you have questions about, in here. We hope to take those at the end. So the purpose of the workshop, the mayor has already noted, we're here to talk about development in our community, and one of the biggest ways that council has an opportunity to influence development is through land use planning. So it's a great opportunity to have our county planning staff engaged as well with our economic development staff. It's cross-functional for sure. For us, I think we're also a community that is has a significant benefit because the industries that we have in our community that are the pillars of the industry in development and opportunity for growth are fairly stable. That's not something that every community has the opportunity to benefit from. And with just for instance, the recent announcement of Bruce C, as well as the onboarding of Unit 6 at Bruce Power, pretty significant for our community and the region as a whole. But if you can flip the slide. Part of the reason for tonight is to provide an opportunity for you to talk about your strategic objectives and how they match with development as well. And if you flip to the next slide, we know what it is that makes development important. We know that it brings, as the mayor has said, opportunities for not just economic prosperity, but community well-being. So it is that focused look at bringing a number of different things together, not only to do one thing of supporting the economy, but also protecting the lands, protecting the natural environment as well. So again, this is a couple of hours that we have here today. One of the reasons that we have invited our keynote speaker to kick this off was a presentation that he made at our Clean Energy Frontier. So we decided to focus today's workshop looking at land use planning and development in our community, but we thought a big picture start would be a really nice way to kick things off. Brock Dickinson is the Director of Economic Development Program at the University of Waterloo. He's an adjunct professor, and this sounds like fun, the entrepreneur in residence at the university. He also has roles currently with the food and wine industry in Niagara about innovation, and is probably a fairly familiar face in the municipal sector because he was the CEO for MDB, which has done quite a number of municipal strategic plans over the years. So lots of experience in this world of the municipal sector. I'm really excited for him to help set the stage. We perhaps gave him a slightly difficult task in only having a half an hour. And then we will move it over to our development team to speak about some of the things that we look at and we're dealing with. And so council has a good picture of what it is that's coming down the pipe. So maybe flip a couple of slides, Jenna. Fantastic. That's our development team. As I mentioned, you're going to hear specifically from Adam, Director Weiser, and our CBO, Dwayne McNabb. And I'm going to kick it off to Mr. Dickinson.
Thank you very much. And I think that warning about having only 30 minutes and that being difficult means that I'm usually pretty long-winded about these things. So I will try to kind of share as much information as I can within this 30-minute time frame, and I'm going to stick around in case there's additional questions or you want to sort of bounce some ideas around as we go through the evening. I recognize this is an informal workshop, but let me start by saying, Your Worship, that all of my comments will be through you, and happy to sort of recognize the structure that's here, but I'll do my best to kind of keep this engaging and fast moving as we move forward. There was a reference to the presentation I did at the Clean Energy Summit, and I don't want to sort of go over a lot of the things. I know some of you were there at that event. I won't go over a lot of that information again, but that was my opportunity to be really pessimistic about where we are in the state of the world. That presentation was called It's the End of the World as We Know It. And there's a sense that, as we think about where we are at the moment in the economy, in our decision making, in the sort of the culture wars and social issues that we're wrestling with, there's some big issues that we've had to kind of struggle with in recent years. We think about how COVID completely upended how we deliver services as municipalities. We think about climate change and the extreme weather events that we're increasingly having to deal with on an ongoing basis. We think about things that seem sometimes distant, like wars, and there's a war in the Ukraine. What does that have to do with how we do our work? Well, the steel, the rebar that most municipalities use in their road construction projects actually came from the Mariupol steel plant in Ukraine. So all of these kind of big things are coming together all at once and creating real challenges and issues for our communities. It feels like we're having a bit of a moment as we try to figure out where we go, what we should be doing, what we should be focusing on and thinking about next. And one of the things I talked about at the Clean Energy Summit was there's all kinds of gurus and experts who have all the answers about what we should do. This is one of my favorites here. This is a fellow named Ray Dalio, who runs the largest hedge fund, the largest investment fund in the world. And he's got all these great charts that explain how the world is changing and why we should be poised for changes. And if you don't believe him, well, there's the proof in the chart, right? And if that chart's not convincing, he's got more charts that have more details in them, right? And eventually we kind of end up in this sort of space where it's really hard to know what the numbers mean, what's going on, what the implications of all these big ideas are for the work that we do on an ongoing basis. So I want to try to tease down just one or two issues tonight that we can kind of think about in terms of how they impact the kinds of issues that we're talking about this evening. And one of the big ones is at the center of a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment. One of the big ones is this sense of demography, the structure of population, the structure of our local population, our national population, our global population, and a lot of things that we sort of took for granted growing up are suddenly changing, and it's creating real issues and challenges for us that affect the way that we develop. So what you see on the screen is a population pyramid. This is how demographers look at the structure of a population. At the bottom is all the young people in a community. At the top is all the old people. So lots of newborns, very few 110-year-olds, right? It's sort of the sense that they get smaller in number as they go up. This is actually the population pyramid for Niger in West Africa. This is what's called a traditional, a classic sort of population pyramid. But here's the population pyramid for Canada over the last few decades. And one of the things that we can see is that it doesn't follow that pyramid pattern, right? That what we're really kind of seeing over time is a sort of a hollowing out at the bottom of that population pyramid, that we have an aging population. There aren't as many young people as there are boomers, for example. And so there's this sort of sense that kind of creates some interesting implications for how our economies work. One of those is that the percentage of Canadians who are actively engaged in the workforce has been declining now for more than 20 years. So there are fewer and fewer people in the workforce, or fewer people, a lower percentage of people in the workforce over time. And coming out of COVID, we suddenly sort of were struck by this notion that, hey, there's a kind of a workforce shortage going on. Where did all the workers go? And some of our first reaction was, well, it's all those lazy 20-somethings hanging out in their parents' basements, right? They just won't go and get a real job. The reality is that that's not what's driving this. In fact, if we dive more deeply into the data, we can see that people under the age of 54 are actually participating in the local labor force at higher levels than they have in the past. The number of young people and middle-aged people in the workforce is growing. But the number of older people, the number of people 55 and above, and I'm happily part of that group now, but the number 55 and above is declining. People are retiring early, they're leaving the workforce, they're deciding not to come back after COVID. So this is not a problem of, the kids don't want to work. This is that some of the rest of us don't want to work so much anymore. And this has created huge gaps in the workforce with implications for all kinds of industries at the local level. So one of the things that we can see is that in the face of this kind of growing workforce shortage, people are leaving, abandoning jobs in certain industries. So we can see in the accommodations and food services sector, for example, traditionally jobs don't pay a lot in that space. So a lot of people are opting to leave those low paying jobs because they can get a job in another sector that pays so much more. If we have a workforce shortage, there's more jobs than people. So I can move around and I can trade my low paying job for a high paying job. And so we see this kind of movements within the local workforce as people kind of leave those jobs that they might have traditionally been in to try to find something that gives them greater advantage. One of the other effects that this has had is that wages in virtually every sector of the economy, in fact, we can say every sector of the economy except mining, wages have risen since the end of the pandemic. So we're going to talk about inflation in a few minutes, but this is sort of one of the key causes of what's going on the inflation side, that in every industry in the country, wage rates are rising. That's because we're competing to attract those workers as they leave those low paid jobs. We want them to come to company X's higher paid jobs. So we got to raise the wages to get them there. And this is creating a lot of angst in the workforce. Partly, this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. I always say that one of the interesting pieces of research during the COVID pandemic was that over the last 1,000 years, after every pandemic or plague, we've seen wage rates rise. So we should have expected this to a certain extent. But this demographic reality is really what's sort of underpinning this rapid increase in wages, this high level of mobility in the workforce, and this sense that there's a bit of a workforce shortage out there. So this has a couple of results when we sort of think about what this means for the economy. One is this is part of the story around inflation, that as workers kind of move to higher paid jobs, that means the employers have to earn more money to pay those higher paid workers. So this is one of the things that causes some level of inflation. The other thing that this points to is the need for immigration in a country like Canada. If we have lower and lower participation rates in the workforce, where are we going to get workers? We're not giving birth to them in the country. We have to find them somewhere else. So we're sort of saying, well, they're giving birth to them somewhere else outside the country. Let's lure them into Canada and do something to bring them here and keep them here and sort of bring them into our workforce. And in fact, Canada has become the sort of the most pro-immigration country in the history of the world, that we are going out all over the place to try to lure workers to come here to take these jobs. And most recently, that's resulted in sort of federal announcements that we will start to take 500,000 immigrants a year or more as a way of addressing this looming labor force shortage. If we can't find workers, we need more bodies. Those bodies have to come from outside the country. And so let's ramp up the efforts to kind of bring them into the country. That also has some interesting implications. And one of the ones that we've really struggled with in recent months and years is rising housing prices. Right? It's hard for young people to think about how they can afford that first home. Even rental rates are sort of going through the roof. This chart here shows on the right-hand side how real estate prices have risen in Canada over the course of the last 10 years. And one of the interesting things, this is Germany and I think the UK, that I can't see that far, but that is sort of compared side by side there. Although everybody's seen sort of rising real estate rates in recent years, since the pandemic, most other countries have started to drop off a little bit. And we dropped off momentarily in Canada, and then the prices started rising again. And part of what's happening is you bring 500,000 new people into the country, you're increasing the demand for the housing stock. And if we already had expensive housing and we're increasing demand, it means we're going to continue to push the prices higher. And so we can see some of the implications of what this means at the local level by thinking about or looking at some of these numbers. And so that housing cost is one feature of what's going on in the inflation story. The cost of labor is another. But in fact, there's a whole sort of series of things that are underway. This chart this is data that I pulled this morning, so this is right up to date. This shows the kind of the levels of inflation in Canada. And one of the things that we can see is that, in fact, our inflation has been relatively stable over the last few months. After some big jumps last year and the year before, it's been kind of flat. Every politician we know wants to take some level of credit for that. But the reality is that we can see on these lines, we break out the different causes of inflation. Food costs have been a big cause of inflation, but energy costs early on were a big cause of inflation a year or so ago. But over the last year, energy costs have fallen dramatically. We've seen a big decline in energy costs, which means inflation has started to come down. Now, I don't know about you, I'm not really ready to bank on energy prices staying low for the longer term, right? So I think that although we like to think that all these interest rates have kind of killed inflation or slowed it down or these sorts of things, and we're almost through the rough times, that because energy costs are likely to rise moving forward, that inflation will also probably rebound moving forward. And that has some really interesting implications. There's some good news in all of this in the sense that Canada doesn't seem to be as affected by this as other wealthy industrialized nations. The US, the UK, Germany, France, they're all suffering worse than we are when it comes to inflation. But we can't pretend that we're not going to be sort of facing some inflation issues moving forward. And that the projections suggest that we might not have the kind of roller coaster that we've had over the last 2 years, but that inflation seems to be here and it's stubborn. And that has some real implications for the kinds of issues you're struggling with and wrestling with and talking about in the municipal context. So we start to think about the interaction of these different ideas, immigration, inflation, the kinds of decisions that you have to make in municipalities. These start to interact in ways that you have to think about on an ongoing basis. If inflation is going to continue to rise, that suggests that everything you do as a municipality is going to get more expensive. If the population is going to continue to grow, to be driven by immigration, just those additional people that you're bringing into the community will demand more services. They'll demand more support. And so these sort of two big issues that we've talked about, inflation and immigration, really kind of put some pressure on municipalities. A lot of municipalities sort of compare their tax increases over time to a factor that combines inflation and population growth to sort of see whether they're in line with each other. This is a slide from some recent discussions in the city of Edmonton, where they're showing that even though they've had some fairly hefty tax increases over time, they haven't been able to keep pace with that level of inflation plus the level of growth. And part of what this suggests is that municipalities everywhere are struggling with the notion of how we overcome that separation that's occurring, that as our expenses rise, our revenues are not able to kind of keep pace with some of the things that are happening. And we can see that at a practical level, that creates some sort of looming gaps in the system. How do municipalities derive their revenues? Well, principally from property taxes. And it's the sort of the classic story of, we have an aging population. We have people who bought their houses 20, 30 years ago. They're now sort of nearing or entering retirement. The value of the house is rising because of the pressures on the real estate market. And yet the incomes of the people living in those houses are dropping. And how are we going to sort of raise the taxes in that kind of a context? And so the solution to these issues really is where we start to think about what this means for economic development, because there's principally two ways that we can start to overcome that gap. And one is that we need to attract new residents and new workers to our communities, people who can share the tax burden with those that are already here. And we need to attract new commercial and industrial operations to our communities so that not all of the new tax burdens that are arising because of inflation and these other challenges are placed on the existing homeowners. So, that's economic development 101. We kind of understand that that's why we need to do economic development. But I think this kind of leads us to some interesting sorts of implications. And this is a chart, a slide that you're going to see a lot over the course of the evening. You've already kind of internalized some of these ideas in your strategic planning as a community. So you have talked about the need to improve your investment readiness, for example, as a way of kind of bringing more external investment into the community. You have talked about proactively planning for infrastructure to meet population growth. You've embedded some of these ideas into your plans. And I guess the challenge that you've got this evening is starting to think about some of the practical implications of what's been put into those plans. Because we can see that, even over the last few years, the numbers around these issues are really starting to affect Kincardine. So this is a chart showing population in Kincardine from the last 5 national censuses. For a while, for many years, Kincardine's growth was, 1% a year, 2% a year. Between, I think, 2006 and 2011, your population grew by 1 person. Now your growth is sort of 7, 8, 9% between census surveys. And there's this sense that population growth that we're talking about is already on its way here. And the implications of that are looming large. And in some sense, that's good because we're moving into what we often refer to as the knowledge economy, right? I would say What's the secret sauce for the knowledge economy? How do you succeed in this kind of an economy? Well, the answer is right there in the name, right? It's knowledge. Knowledge is what drives this kind of new economy that we're moving into. And where does knowledge sit? Where does it reside? Well, it sits inside the brains of the people who make up our community. There's two Swedish economists, Kjell Nordstrom and Jonas Ridderstråle, who say the most important resource for any company, for any community, wears shoes and walks out the door at 5 o'clock every day. The most important asset you have for economic development is the people who live inside your community. And if your population is growing, that means you're getting more of these knowledge assets. And that's something that you can kind of build on and take advantage of. But how do we do that? How do we sort of begin to attract employers to the community to take advantage of this growing population and the opportunities that we see in a community like this to grow a stronger economy? Well, we often sort of talk about investment readiness as a key component of this. How do we sort of think about whether our community ranks or rates with others when it comes to the private sector making decisions about where to invest their money? And there are a series of kind of formal processes that most investors work through when they're trying to figure out what community to put their next operation or their next plant or their next store into. And this is a fairly formal process. They start with a long list. They might have 1,000 communities on their long list, and they begin to gather data about those communities. And at this point, it's all happening in secret. Your economic development staff, your planning staff, nobody will know that a company might be considering you as part of this long list of communities. They're just kind of working through the data in the background. They're hoping that you might have some of it available on your website or in a community profile document or that sort of thing, but they're collecting that data and ultimately they make a short list. And once they've got the short list, then they really start to dive into cost comparisons between communities. And they might get their list down from 1,000 to 10 communities and go and visit those 10 communities. And ultimately, out of those visits, they'll decide on just 1 or 2 where they're actually going to site their operation. And so investment readiness is really about saying, as we think about all the steps in that process, is our municipality providing the information, the support, the services that will allow that company to move our community from the long list of 1,000 down to that sort of final 1 or 2 that we want to spend some time thinking about. Now, in terms of how they make that assessment, there's a couple of ways of sort of looking at the different types of data that are really important to investors as they consider communities. There's cost-based data or quantitative data. That has in fact become less important over time. That qualitative information about your community has become more important than quantitative information in a lot of ways. So you think about, Apple or Microsoft or some of these big companies, when they're putting up a new operation somewhere, are they looking for the cheapest place in the world to go? No, they're looking for creative workers, a nice environment for their workers to live in, a community that has strong infrastructure and amenities. So cost is not the driver that it was 20 or 30 years ago. Quality, the qualitative aspects of what a community has are the ones that are really important. And in particular, we seem to be kind of focused on 3 of those qualitative issues as jumping to the fore in how companies make decisions about where to invest. That labor and the availability of workforce is a big factor. I got to move closer so I can actually read this. Infrastructure, that is, do you have the infrastructure in place already to facilitate their investment? And risk, how risky is your community as a place to make investments? So let me talk very briefly to each of those 3. In the context of workforce and labor, what investors are really looking for is a community that's spiky. What do I mean by spiky? This is a term that we take from Richard Florida, who's a professor at the University of Toronto. He said you could take any skill, any kind of certification or set of knowledge and place it on a map. You could take all of the PhDs in astrophysics in the world, or all of the plumbers in the world, all of the electricians, all of the dairy farmers, and you put them on a map. And some communities will be spikier than others. There will be concentrations of certain kinds of knowledge in certain places. And so employers are often looking for concentrations of knowledge, spikiness of skill in communities when they're deciding where to go. If I'm working in a certain industry, I want to try to go to a place that is spiky with skills related to that industry. And so workforce becomes not just this question of how many workers do you have, but what do your workers know? What have they done before? What kind of skills do they have to bring to bear? Infrastructure is the second piece that companies are increasingly looking for. And in the current climate, the focus on infrastructure often relates to the question of what's sometimes referred to as shovel readiness. That is a particular parcel of land or a particular site or a particular building that I might move my operation into, is it ready to go? Is the infrastructure already in place? If it is, great, I can be up and running in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, whatever the time frame is to get my permits and sort of organize myself to get things built and up and running. If the servicing isn't in place, I'm not shovel ready. And a community that has a shovel ready site represents an opportunity that's 2 or 3 years closer than a community that doesn't have a shovel ready site. And so a lot of the decision making around where to go relates to how much of the infrastructure is already in place. How much is already there? Because if it's not already there, can I afford to defer my investment for 2, 3, 4 years until it is? No, when business is making these site decisions, they want to go immediately. They need to go to the place that's shovel ready. And finally, on the level of risk, we often sort of talk about the notion of political risk. So this is not risk in terms of, bad weather or I can't get my supplies on time or things like this, but is the political environment at the local level such that I can trust the systems that have been put in place? If there's a community improvement plan, can I expect that the incentives offered under that plan will really be available when I make my application? Can I expect that the decisions around things like zoning and various permitted uses will be standardized for everybody who comes and not sort of tweaked on an ongoing basis? Can I expect that when the municipality suggests they might offer something, that I can rely on that down the road? I live in the city of St. Catharines, and we've made some terrible decisions on this front over the last 20 years. And it's really played havoc with our opportunities for development because the development community no longer trusts the municipality. That it's gone sort of back on its decisions or undermined its own program so many times that developers are reluctant to come to that community. And so that political risk factor is the third sort of piece of this investment readiness puzzle that we need to be aware of. So I think, when we're talking to communities often about how to kind of take advantage or take control of this investment readiness process, we talk about a series of principles that need to guide your work as you think about how to get your community ready. Some of that is that notion of a consistency and responsiveness in local government that suggests that level playing field in the absence of political risk. Some of it is the notion of a dynamic and growing workforce, that that employers can expect that they'll have workers in the community if they locate there. And some of it is the availability of shovel-ready grounds as well. There are other factors. Does your community look and feel nice? Is it a great place to live? Do you have sort of high levels of regional cooperation within your neighborhood? Those are important as well. But those three factors that we've touched on today are often key for companies as they're sort of thinking about where to put their operations. So I think we can draw a couple of sort of concluding thoughts around this as we think about what this means for some of the discussions this evening. Investment readiness is necessary but not sufficient to some of the things that we want to do. Sort of having some formal programs in place is great. One of the things that we often look at in economic development is what are the sectors of the economy that are going to be growing next, and how do we sort of take advantage of that? You're in a really unique position because as we look at projections for the nuclear industry over the next 20 or 30 years, there's all kinds of amazing opportunities emerging there. Some in the sort of the realm of established players, others in emerging fields like small modular reactors, this sort of thing. And I'm not here tonight to say you should double down on the nuclear industry, that we can have presentations around those sorts of things on other occasions. But the reality is that when you think about what kind of investment you want, it isn't just to be ready for all investment, it's to be ready for the kinds of investment that you think your community needs. And that means that you have in place the tools that sort of already identify what you want as a community, that you have an economic development strategy. It talks about the kinds of industries you're going after. You have an official plan. It talks about the kinds of development you want to have in place. And part of what happens is that those documents kind of form the basis of your investment readiness approach. They already tell you what you want to do and what some of the rules are for how you'll do it. The question then is how you sort of drive them forward and move them forward. And part of how we sort of look at that is that at council itself, you set the vision. You set those targets, you develop those plans, you kind of determine the directions that the community needs to go in, and then staff develops and implements the specific actions around those. And the strategies, the official plans become a kind of an expression of the practical implementation aspects of the vision that you've created as the council. And so I think that sort of understanding that vision, that strategy, those formal planning documents really kind of guide the work on a day-to-day basis helps to kind of address those bigger issues in the investment readiness process. And in particular, that sense of political risk is one of the things that companies consider at this point. So hopefully that's at least a little bit of clarification as we sort of try to derive some sense from all of these big trends and big issues that we're struggling with and wrestling with. As I say, not much that we can kind of get into in the space of 30 minutes itself, but I'm really interested in kind of hearing more of your conversations over the course of the evening. And if at any point I can offer insights, commentary, feedback, ideas, I'm happy to do that. So I've also left an email address there if anybody wants to follow up on any of the ideas at any point as well. Thank you.
Thank you. If that's all right, I will jump in. I appreciate that, Brock. I appreciate you abiding to the timeline we gave you. You bang on. We also have a great crew from the County of Bruce who are part of our development team, and they're here today as well to give a presentation to council, just a reminder and an overview of how some of those pieces that Brock spoke about in terms of setting out the vision through an official plan type document and how that cascades through a provincial policy and on the ground to actual development applications, how that works together. Now, I will say Brock has agreed to stick around for the entire presentation today. So when you are in your work groups, after the presentations, we do have opportunity for council members to break off into 3 different groups. He will take the opportunity to visit. And if you have questions at that point for him, that's a great time to ask them. So I'm going to turn it over to Jack Van Dorp, who's the manager of land use planning. His colleague, Karina Smith, is with him as well as the senior planner for Bruce County as also.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to try to make sure that our presentation about policy inherits some of the dynamism that we got from Brock. So with gratitude, we've got a really boring slide in 2, and it's about the hierarchy of the system we work in. So if we just get, oh, is this on me? There we go. Oh gosh. The framework. Cool. So what we wanted to talk about a little bit, Jill made a note of. So the planning system works as a hierarchy, and it's a policy-based system. And so the province sets the ground rules. We all exist because the province said we exist as municipalities. And then they said, here's the structure in which you do planning, and it's called the Planning Act. And then they said in the Planning Act, we're going to make some provincial plans where they matter. In Bruce County, that's the Niagara Escarpment Plan. And then they said, we're going to make statements and you have to follow them. And you're going to follow them through your official plan at the county level, through a local official plan, and then through your zoning bylaw. So this slide just shows that hierarchy. Starts at the top and goes all the way down. The province, when they say, you know, we're gonna issue policy statements and you have to follow them. Some of that is actually setting the stage to be ready for growth, the way that Brock has described. So it talks about how servicing infrastructure is important, and we need to have servicing infrastructure, and the hierarchy of infrastructure. Full is better, partial is not as good, private is okay when it's okay. It talks about protecting what's important, like natural heritage features. It defines some of them and then says to municipalities, you need to figure out how you're going to map these and protect them. It also says things like you need to have an inventory of land that's ready to go. Some of that shovel readiness, you've got service land, you've got draft approved land. And it also says we need to do things like intervene through policy to help supply housing to the full spectrum, because the market alone doesn't meet all of our housing needs. So presently that says we need to have targeted interventions to support the 60th percentile, so more than half of the population for whom the market wouldn't meet their housing needs on its own. So we currently are working with a policy statement from 2020. You can see there, previous PPSs came through in 2014, 2005. The province is currently consulting on a new planning statement. I think we've had some correspondence through county commenting with respect to that, but we're looking to see what the province does with that and what that will mean in terms of our steps on the policy hierarchy. And we have to, as the law says, be consistent with those planning statements. So at our level, what we get to do is have a vision through official plans. So we'll have community strategic plans, we'll have community investment plans. From a land use perspective, how things happen on the ground is reflected in that official plan. And so they set out what we want to achieve, how we map that, and then how we set out the policy framework to direct development where it's supposed to go. There is a requirement in the Planning Act that all municipal decisions align with that plan. So that means the plan is very important. It also means what we put in the plan or don't put in the plan is important. Sometimes that can be sometimes the policies in the plan can be a boon in terms of making sure that we get things done the way we want them to be. If they're not carefully considered, they can also represent barriers to the things that we need to see or to our ability to respond to change. So the county has an upper tier official plan, and then there's a Kincardine plan and a Kincardine bylaw. And the local plans and bylaws have to follow the county plan. They can have more detail, but they can't be less restrictive. Sometimes that means we have goofy things like amendments to the county plan to facilitate something that's approved by the local plan. And we don't particularly like those scenarios, and we're working to try to address those whenever they occur. So our county plan was adopted way back in 1997. It's a good plan. It was founded on the principles of sustainable development, but it's at the end of its plan horizon. We changed the way we count amendments to the plan when we hit 250, because there was a bunch of other changes, but you can get a sense of how many times it's been amended. I am happy to say, in terms of some of that investment readiness or being prepared to support things, we have made some changes to that plan in the last couple of years that have significantly reduced the number of times somebody who wants to do something, a person wanting to do something, has to get an amendment to the county plan, which adds time and defers their ability to start putting their capital to work. So that plan is a high level plan. It does provide some direction for settlement areas, which are then detailed through the local plans. And it also functions as the only plan for the countryside. So that's just some context for the county plan. We have a cool little video. I don't know if it'll work. Maybe we can get it queued up. And this just kind of highlights what we're looking at and working on as we move forward. I think the next thing we're looking for will be some growth forecast slides. So there's some green blocks. So I think slide 15. There we go. Perfect. We're right there. So we're looking at growth projections as part of our official plan work, and hinted at in that video is this good growth concept of looking at what kind of growth we forecast, where we expect it to go, and then how do we make sure that we have the infrastructure and the resources in place to support it. So this forecasting work was completed a couple of years ago. Pretty broad engagement, but a pre-Bruce C announcement forecast in terms of what we would see in terms of our growth, and then how that translates into jobs per hectare, and what's our supply, and what do we need. So we had a employment growth forecast indicating overall for the community of Kincardine that there's sufficient employment land. It's a little bit variable where that is. I think most of it is in the BEC, Bruce Energy Center lands near the Bruce Power site, and some of the lands in the community might be a little constrained, and Karina's going to get into that a little more in a moment. The other thing we did was prepare a population forecast, and so this is looking at a lot of that demographic work to see, we expect people to come into the community related to jobs. We also have a large population that is already making its way up the demographic ladder, if you will. And over time, over the next 25-year period, we will start to see some change in the population at the top of the ladder. And so that affects some of the overall supply requirements. But what we did see through this forecast was a 2,000 unit surplus. The notes around this are, we have to be aware of ongoing things like announcements with respect to major provincial or nationally strategic infrastructure in our community or communities. We also have to be aware the province is continually revising its forecasts, often upward, with respect to what we might see. We're working to try to, with local staff, to try to keep a close eye on the actual pace of development relative to these forecasts, and also what other land uses could come in or change. So for example, a new school site could impact your residential land supply if lands are taken from that. So there is land in Kincardine that hasn't yet been allocated a use. So that's a plus. You've got some flexibility there, but that's all things we're looking at and working with you to help make sure that we're able to support from a policy perspective and from a land supply perspective, the different types of uses that we need. With that, I'm going to hand over to Karina, who's going to talk a little bit more about your local plan and bylaw.
Okay. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Okay, so in terms of the municipality's official plan, so as Jack indicated as part of the hierarchy, the local official plan, Kincardines official plan, needs to conform with the county official plan. And this plan that you have was adopted in 2021, and so it's relatively new compared to some of the other municipalities in Bruce County. This area covers both the primary urban communities as well as the secondary urban communities, so your main growth areas. And then the county official plan, as Jack indicated, covers the rest of the municipality in terms of the rural lands. This plan has a higher level of detail than the county official plan. It sets out all the land use designations in terms of where you want to see certain things happen, where you want growth to happen. It sets out the policies associated with that. And it also sets out other vision and objectives for the municipality in terms of how it grows going into the future. And this is just an excerpt, and I know you had this in your agenda as well in terms of some of the mapping from the Kincardine official plan. So there's the downtown kind of core of Kincardine, as well as the secondary urban communities out towards Bruce Power and then Tiverton as well. We did want to just have a brief moment to highlight the employment land. So as you could see in the growth projections, the municipality does have a surplus of lands, but currently within the local official plan, most of those employment lands are within the Bruce Energy Center. There are other employment lands in Kincardine. What the policies do allow for mixed use in a lot of those employment areas. And so we do see currently a lot of proposals coming forward that have a high percentage of residential in that mixed use component. And so really the question is, are there tools that we could use? Is there further detail that we could provide to these proponents as to what we want to see in terms of that mix of uses? We may also need to consider protecting employment lands to better accommodate those future growth projections as well. So if we go in kind of into the next level of that hierarchy, it's the municipal zoning bylaw, and this is kind of where the real work happens. So this implements the PPS and the policies that are found in the official plans. It lays out the rules of where things can go and what they will look like. So it outlines in each specific zone what are the permitted uses, what are the development standards, so setbacks, heights, etc. It outlines the general provisions for uses and development, including parking standards as an example. And then it also has special provisions that may be either site or area specific. And that's where you start seeing very specific amendments coming in. Those may be included in special provisions. And I should note just on the bylaw covers the entirety of the municipality, obviously, and does lay out all of those land uses specifically. So also stemming from the kind of hierarchy of the policies that we play in, we also have the master plans. So these are your master servicing strategy as an example, which kind of take what your vision is for the community and says this is the infrastructure we need to support that growth. It sets out the timing for those services and when that needs to occur, and it's based on the growth projections for the municipality. And I think that brings us over to municipal staff.
Thank you very much to Jack and Karina for that presentation. So I think both Adam and Dwayne will be speaking to the next section related to development and what's actually happening on the ground and some of the perspectives we hear in terms of where are their challenges and where are there opportunities for some tweaks.
Thanks, Jill. So the first slide here from our group, as Jill mentioned, starts talking about the challenges that we do see and what does that really look like as a whole with development processes. So one of the main things that we have to do now and related to recent bill changes, we have to be fairly meticulous in terms of tracking. So when we have a development submission, we have timelines that correspond that we have to adhere to based on provincial regulations or guidelines. And so through that, we'll receive a package. And once that package is deemed to be complete, or likewise at county planning, we have so many days to process our review and provide comments and essentially get to a point where we can close out a development submission. So with that, beyond Kincardine, in terms of our development team, we'll receive that, or again, the county, and that will go out to a number of agencies that will review and provide comment to that. So, when we look at different agencies, we think of groups such as the Conservation Authority, different highway agencies, so Bruce County Highways, the provincial highway being MTO, getting into specialists and third parties that that we may need involved with traffic or other studies and stuff like that too. So one of the things that this term of council will now be somewhat familiar with through, I guess, Dwayne and myself or our group, we've brought forward reports that have H on them. So that's a holding. Typically what the purpose of that holding on a file or a site is to make sure that provisions are adhered to before we get to a point where a developer can go ahead. So it's a safeguard in a sense. And what that does is it makes sure that all the boxes are checked before we come back to say, we're ready to go. Everything is compliant here, and we'd like council to support lifting, that red tape in a sense, so that way they can start work. The next one, municipal layering of agreements on development. So we've listed here, site plan agreement combined with subdivision, condominium. And so a recent one actually that we've had through council is the Bradstone file. So you would have seen a number of different agreements related to that. Some of which are site plan, and then the most recent being a development agreement. And so it just displays the convolution of trying to get a development essentially from the first time they knock on the door to a point where they actually can start work in the field. And with all of that in mind, I mean, that still only gets them to the point where they're able to service that site. Beyond that, they still have to get checkoffs in a sense to say that everything has been satisfied, and then that enables Dwayne and his team to start looking at building permits and issuing those following that. And then the last piece, certainly over the last few years, we've seen an influx both at the county level from a planning application perspective, and then here on development proposals, a number of files that have come forward. So if you're trying to drive the bus with the same horsepower, but you have more occupants on it, it tends to maybe bog down a bit. So with that in mind, we've got only so many people that can administer these files. So that's, from the date it comes in, our planning coordinator will receive it, take a look to make sure everything's there. Then that gets circulated out for comment. Comments get received back to that individual. We summarize that, send that back to the developer. And then we work our way through, once we are satisfied from a technical perspective, start working through the agreement itself. So that entails drafting that agreement, some back and forth between the stakeholders, and then getting it to a point where we're satisfied at a staffing level where we're comfortable to bring that back to council with a recommendation to consider continuing forward. So so just, that last note really just references that there has been a lot on the go, and balancing all of that along with other priorities. The resources are what they are, I guess, in a sense, to do that and to manage it.
And just to further what Adam said there with the holding provisions, a lot of them in our current zoning bylaw are restrictive holding provisions that add in a site plan control, which through this council, we've also introduced a site plan control bylaw, which will help us advance projects through that bylaw and that control versus putting it through the zoning bylaw. So we're going to go through that through our comprehensive view, see what provisions we have that are holding provision related for site plan only, because we have a current bylaw that will oversee that now. And we have our marching orders and our directions that help us guide through developments on what we need for approvals through site plan control. So that's how we're going to help advance things a bit easier based on what we have to work with to get these developments to the finish line. So on this one here, this is some of the development perspectives on what's getting in the way of proposed developments. And when we do a site plan application, or we receive an application, when we do our circulation, we do have a lot of commenting agencies that comment on the site plan that we're circulated. Some of them are keep an eye on this or some advice. Some are also crossing over from different perspectives of the reviewing agencies. So we're trying to streamline the comments so we can at least have a chance to coordinate our responses to the developer without overlapping different agencies with other agencies. So by streamlining that and keeping the comments based on a regulatory regime, it helps us also coordinate our comments back to the developer where we're not jumping lanes. So that's just also to help expedite developments and keep it consistent with developers. So we're not jumping from lane to lane and they get a mixed signal. And we just don't want to project that. So some of the developer delays we may see, and it's just with the nature of the businesses. We may get different proposals throughout the course of 6 months where they've done a market analysis and changed direction, said that based on this type of development, the numbers don't make sense at 25 units. I need to get to 30 or so on and so forth. And that changes our whole direction because now we got to reevaluate the parking. Possibly we have some zoning infractions for height, lot coverage, a resubmission on a traffic impact study. There's so many things that domino when they change direction. And it affects us in a way that we're playing catch up because they want us, and we just changed this. Well, the smallest change could be a nightmare for both Adam and myself, from infrastructures to sizing a capacity of what we've allocated. So there's a number of things that we try to notify the developer up front, said this is something we want to be as close as we can initially, or it just adds timelines to it, and we want to work with them around that. Upfront costs, I'm sure council is well aware of our development charges. One of the first things that I get asked is what's the DCs? And again, DCs are based on a square footage charge and a unit charge. One's for residential units, other one's for commercial, which is based on square footage. So we try to keep those in mind too, and you'll see coming forward on a few of these slides where our development charges kind of align with our other fees. And they're an important part of development because they are some significant numbers that the council needs to be aware of. And then the last one, our acronyms there. I'm sure that everyone's heard of NIMBYs and bananas, which is just basically just flat. It's just pushed back from development that may not be comfortable in certain areas or just doesn't want to see change. And that's always a factor that we deal with. That's why we have public meetings and hearings and circulations to hopefully address any of those concerns to the public going forward.
So the next slide, we speak to, what the developers look for when they want to come here to Kincardine to develop. So first, a government that has a reputation of wanting to work with developers. So they want it to be a back and forth relationship, in a sense, something that that both parties are striving kind of for a common goal. So all else being equal, the more efficient community will win for development. So one thing with developers, especially with larger developers, if we're not a community that's open and willing, they're going to find property in another location adjacent to us. Potential developers will look at past decisions from a community to try and predict if their project will be approved or not. So decisions that we make at a staffing level, decisions that are made at the council table and at a council level, those will be, set as benchmarks in a sense. People will, look at those and, hope that they're going to be treated consistently, fairly, and that those are things that'll be available to them as well. So they look for councils that make decisions for the benefit of the present and future generations. They look for a community that is organized and plans for their growth. So one thing that we've been doing from a planning perspective and an infrastructure aspect, updating our master plans and understanding where we need to consider capital investment for water and wastewater considerations, and how that may or may not impact growth lands that are in the community. So that's an area that the past term and this term of council have made investments in to make sure that we are ready for those things. Easy and clearly outlined process for development. So, once they knock on the door and talk to our planning coordinator, what is the information readily available? Is it easy to follow? Is the support there? And then, a big component of it, a good understanding of the cost up front. Development can be substantial in terms of an investment, and they want to understand, what that investment may look like. They've got to make business case decisions to understand what their profit margins are and what they need to consider, the sale of a lot as an example, and factor that in once they know kind of the upfront costs. So making sure that we're transparent and can provide that detail to them is beneficial right out of the gate.
This slide here is just a quick example of what you'd be looking at for a single family dwelling on full municipal services, on just a comparator where you have your development charges portions as about 23,300, and based on a 2,000 square foot home, you're looking about $3,200 in building permit fees. These are also important numbers that we look at too, especially with the climate that we're in right now. We see our development sliding a little bit because it's just the way that we bounced back after COVID, and with the interest rates, we're consistent with a lot of other municipalities that are seeing a bit of a drop in that. with that drop, we gotta understand too, that with council's direction to have building departments operate as a user pay system. We want to keep an eye on those numbers too, if we have to raise our building permit fees to cover staff costs. So we always try to keep an eye on the numbers that we get for development charges or billing fees, whether it be sewer, water, frontage charges, stuff like those all factor in and are one of the things that developers look for those upfront costs.
So we'll give Alex a minute here. He's gonna pull up essentially our map hub feature, and then we'll walk through the list of developments. He'll basically reference where the site is so we can get our boundaries, and we'll talk briefly about, you know, what the development may be, where we are at a high level in terms of status and whatnot. All right, so the red outline there for the first one, that is the Staybridge Suites. So that's our CR developers. So that initial phase is a 4-story hotel building. We do have a site plan agreement in place for them. We recently received approvals from the MTO. So we're essentially in a position to issue building permits for the structure itself, pending.
It was,
They're good?
actually, that was just
Okay.
issued September 1st there,
Perfect.
so
So.
they are officially underway and you'll see some developments up there starting to move around.
So they've started with the initial phase with earthworks and pre-servicing. Something that council will see in the coming months as well relates to the servicing extension across the highway. So I've been working with BM Ross over the course of the year to get approvals from MTO to be able to bring those pipes across the highway. Been working with a number of stakeholders on the east side of the highway that I'll call benefiting property owners. To understand what their intentions are with their development lands, to make them aware of the potential servicing and essentially working towards bringing agreements to them for that financial contribution. So between tendering and those financial commitments from other parties that are benefiting, those are some of the details that'll come back to council yet over the next quarter.
Yeah. Just to recount, council's familiar with our map hub that we've set up and got running. Okay, so we try to make sure that the site plan that's attached to that's live. We try to make sure that we've had a formal application submitted, and then we can put a formal site plan up there so it's relative to what the actual proposal is. If there is a change or change in direction, we try to make sure that gets updated. So these should be correct and accurate to today's date anyways. But we'll go through the next one there, which is, I do believe Alex on there, and that's for Golf Links. That's the Linston Group off of Queen Street there at Golf Links. And that's for the 33 single family residential, plus a mixed single family residential and townhouse. And that one's just, I do believe we're in the final stage. We just had a subdivision agreement complete and registered for that project as well.
And so quickly on that too, if council was to take a drive by, you know, either today or when you're done or sometime soon, you will see equipment on site. Burnham Excavating is there. And they're doing the storm water works for the developer. They've got a timeline. Typically with a conservation authority, you'll have an in-water works period. So they're there doing that work in advance of then moving on to some of the servicing for water and sanitary.
That's just one, two for you.
Okay, perfect.
Last one, this was just recently through council, and that was through a site plan agreement layered over top. We had also a development agreement because they did apply for a plan of condominium. So we did put a development agreement together for that. And that's a 10-block, 36-unit development. And that one also should be finalized here real soon to get all the financials put to rest, and then we can have that project going as well.
Jumping across the highway here. So the lands that are known as the Smart Center lands. So that's at Highway 21 and Millennium Way. We do have a 3-story apartment, 45-unit proposal there. Essentially, we are at a point where we have a drafted agreement. We have all of the considerations satisfied. And we're just working with the Smart Centers team on the Russell Street upgrades. So with that, there is a component that includes construction of turn lanes. So eastbound turn lanes if you're heading north or south on the highway. And so there's a contribution from the benefiting landowner that the MTO is seeking. So we're working with Smart Centers to satisfy what that agreement may look like. Once they're content with that, they could essentially proceed with construction. Yeah, so I mean, the upgrades for the intersection at the highway are substantial, and so their concerns primarily hinge around currently they are the benefiting landowner solely, and so they're wanting to discuss potentially contributions from the municipality for consideration or considerations to look at it as a benefit to some of the other lands. So an example, when we constructed the Durham Street extension, from a municipal perspective, we did an area specific development charge with that. And so all of the lands as a whole share the burden of that cost versus it just being the Smart Centers land. So.
Okay, just your follow on. The next two are a bit different. We've had some change in direction from the developer on both these. One is 7 Millennia Way, and that one's not formally completed from an application standpoint, but they've submitted now. It's a 2 6-story apartment building with a townhouse with 4 townhouses to go with that. So if you know where that one is, it's just right the corner of Durham. If you take
Just-
away, right, yeah.
Yeah.
You're right on it, Alex.
Just north of the
But-
Lakeside dealership.
I know that's not on the map hub because formally the application isn't complete, so we don't want to promote that was going live right at this point, but once we get that finalized, that application, then we'll have that added to the 6-story residential apartments with 4 single-story townhouses proposed in the business park. Yeah, it's like
Mixed use.
yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, Beth had a really good comment there, and it aligns with what Karina and Jack said. With a lot of developments we're seeing in the business park, we're seeing 75% pushing the more residential versus the mixed use. And so we're careful. We're walking through that in alignment with the official plan to say this is the intent is yes, mixed use is identified in our official plan. It does allow for basically residential uses, but we want to keep an eye on that too when we go through for a business park, because we do not want to lose our business park, our C6 zoning to predominantly residential uses. Oh, it's not far.
So the next site is Mount Forest Ave. So they have a 3-story apartment building that's being proposed there. This file did go through an OLT process, and through that there was a resolution through that hearing. There's a number of elements within the decision of the OLT that will be incorporated into that site plan. So similar to when I mentioned about Kincardine Ave and working with benefiting landowners, we have engineering drawings that have been completed for Mount Forest Ave for the reconstruction of that. It probably is one of the worst condition roads within the town of Kincardine, at least. And so with with Mount Forest Ave, one of the elements that we completed there was consultation with the Women's House and with the hospital as well, both to understand how this may impact them if we go to construction, to understand any feedback and input they may have, both into the design and you know what that sequencing may look like. And then meeting with the Mount Forest developer, as well as if we were to kind of zoom out to a broader level, the Ontario Peninsula farmlands, which hover around the hospital to the east and the north. So similar to my comments earlier about working on development agreements and working towards tendering, this is another project that I'm working on actively. So I'm hoping that it'll be another one that'll come back in the last quarter of this year for council to see. And one thing I didn't reference, but this project and the Kincardine Ave one are projects that were presented as part of the capital budget as well, from a servicing lens.
This one was another one that was brought back to council through a site plan agreement for a development in Tiverton. That was for the King's Pearl. And that was for they went through a severance to add on in addition to the back of the lot to help ease some of the parking issues. So it's a site plan agreement to install a parking area. So that one's been through council too. And that one I think is, I know the developer, the owner will be very thankful that one got going. So.
And then the last one on the first side of the sheet is Westridge on the Lake. So this is approximately 400 housing units. And we finally had some commencement here this summer. So there are 3 foundations, I believe, that are in. One, the framing is started, and the other they're working on servicing. So it's slower than I think we probably all predicted, but it's some progress.
Yeah.
All right, so we're jumping a little bit north and we're heading over to Inverhuron here. So off of Richards Drive, if you're familiar with that area off Albert and Richards, there's Woodland Court. And so the proposal there is essentially with the existing mobile homes in there. They're looking to get on municipal servicing, so water and wastewater, and through that enabling them to do a park expansion essentially. So we are at a point where they're working on securing their finances, and that would then satisfy the last condition of that site plan agreement. And then they would be able to start working on their servicing there.
Yep, just north there, same thing in Denver here and there. That's development that we received for Tibbin. That's for the subdivision that's going on there. And I do believe that one's went through the zoning amendment and the county decision there this year. Yeah, sure. The one there's also in Timberton, I do off Main Street there. It's a plan a condo that's going through for Braemart. And I do believe that's that one there. I think it's 8 units, I think. But it has okay, and it has a unique setup where it's gonna have basically a ring road that'll go around it, serving both as the access one way and also a fire department loop. So that one's been working in conjunction too with the development for Fast Holdings on a shared more or less a comprehensive traffic study as well. Sure, that's the area. It is blue right there. Yes, yes.
Just blue. And so with it does, yeah. So there's 2 phases essentially. There's a row of housing that would be on the south side of Maple Street. And then there would be a new private road that would go in it would look like a horseshoe from the north side of Maple Street. So they would have a row of houses kind of down the center and a road that would go around the outside of it.
Thanks, Alex.
We're looking at the potential to connect Maple to Patterson. I'm not sure, but I know it is Patterson there, but, or at least a portion of it, so. Yeah. Okay, slide over to fast. Perfect. So the next one in the same area is Fast Holdings. So it's a substantial site in size. We're just working right now at the planning stage in a sense. So working to satisfy components at the county level, and then Karina's team would bring that back before council for consideration for the draft plan of subdivision. So with that, we just, I guess, kind of reference, but there are around 14 single residential lots that do front Maple Street that we reconstructed. We did service those when we reconstructed Maple Street, and then put servicing stubs into that development to make sure that our investment wasn't compromised, I guess. Okay, so next we're jumping up to the other corner of Tiverton. So a large parcel of land that's just adjacent to lands that we own in behind the cemetery, actually. And so there's a residential proposal there. And so that actually is with the Bradstone Group now. Currently this list says Kramer, but Kramer did sell those lands. And so essentially that's a mix of single and multi-residential units in that development.
Next one's, I'll give Alex a second here. This development's also, it's not updated on here. We haven't finalized the application and prepare for circulation completely yet, but this is off Highway 21 as well. And it's a fairly significant development that comprises a number of apartment buildings as well as townhouse units. So the number of about 595 units proposed on this development. So right now we're going through with some of the issues with MTO, and we'll get some of the circulation comments, of course, collaborated with the developer. And that one we expect to see, hopefully sooner than later, we'll have that site plan also up there.
Sliding into the downtown core. So the vacant parcel of land that is across the road from where Pearson's was, I'm sure many of you councilors, at least certainly in the last term, but possibly in this, have had calls about the state of that site. So that site, we did have a site plan agreement in place for that, and that land did transfer to a new owner. So through that, Dwayne and I and our team, we've been working with that individual and their consultants. So they're working on getting updated plans that'll be submitted for our review, and then we'll be working towards revising that site plan agreement. Through our construction efforts for the downtown reconstruction, we have already collaborated with and incorporated into our plans the required servicing for that proposed building there. That's correct, yeah.
That is one of the biggest changes with the direction that they had originally was a 3-story, now it's going to a 6-story with underground parking. So essentially, we're into a full review because it doesn't resemble anything that was submitted back in 2020. Yeah.
All right, sliding over to Brown's development off Bruce Ave. So we are nearing a point where we will have a subdivision agreement to come to council. So our hope is that we'll have that for council here in the next month or two. For the most part, we've satisfied things with the developer. The last component is working out the funding contribution for the water main upgrade that is required on Bruce Ave. Typically with any development that we may need to perform upgrades to an existing municipal road or asset, we would look to the developer for some element of contribution. So we're just working on what that is. They're exploring a couple avenues to do that, and then what council will see, unless and barring any changes, I guess, but we'll have a proposal to look at reconstruction of Bruce Ave to be considered in the next budget deliberation as well. I'm sure many of you have had emails and calls over the current state of the road there. So the wastewater there actually comes through the Stonehaven subdivision. There is an easement just off of Wick or at the first bend.
And last one we have is, again, just recently came through council for a site plan agreement and holding removal provision that got lifted, and that's for the Kelvin Developments. And that's for the 11 townhouse blocks. Is it coming? I think we just had, sorry, my correction. Sorry, the holding provision was a restrictive covenant on that one, which had a few commitments that they had to satisfy for mutual drain agreement. So yes, They're just finalizing those to have that registered on title, and that will satisfy the holding removal, and then we'll have the site plan agreement finalized as well. Sorry about that. Thanks for the reminder.
Yeah. So we're anticipating October that we'll have that site plan agreement before council.
That's great and perfect timing. So we're just at about 25 after 6. The idea was that this meeting would end at 7. This workshop would end at 7. So that gives council some time to break off into 3 different groups. So essentially, we will set it up where there are 3 members of council, 1 member of staff who is jotting down notes as per your discussion, but you will select one of the representatives from your group of 3 to come back and share the comments and responses to some of the questions or other items that you had thought of throughout today's presentations. So I will ask if maybe we can break off into those tables at the rear of the room. And I see a question from Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. I was hoping for more question period. If you're going to break off in groups, we only have a half an hour. So how much are you expecting for the group discussion versus questions? 'Cause I have a whole page of questions. Thank you.
Yeah, and the point was to write down those questions and have those conversations in the smaller groups and then come back to the larger group.
All right, folks, stop having such a good time. Come back to work again.
All right, folks. Appreciate your willingness to have this discussion and chat amongst yourselves. Each group has a dedicated reporter to report back to the group. So I might start with my group because I know who the reporter is, and that's Councillor Blackwell.
Thank you through the chair. I was just going to say, so we have this was myself, Councillor Kennedy and Deputy Mayor Clark. What makes the municipality of Kincardine unique? We talked about waterfront, the nuclear industry, trails, strong sense of community and neighborhoods in various settlement areas, our increasing diversity, that our demographics are different than many other small rural or urban communities, and that we have a lot of young people moving here. That we have a good mix of rural and urban, many strong recreational facilities, and excellent natural heritage. These are a bit disjointed, but all right. What opportunities should the municipality be pursuing? Supply chain opportunities, the clean energy frontier and nuclear suppliers, trades, skilled trades for the long-term growth of our community, long-term care and seniors support, healthcare recruitment, the new high school, financially responsible development that will support infill and reduce sprawl, growing in the entire municipality, not only in the Ward 1 area, and the unification of the municipality's identity. So looking to create a cohesive identity across the whole area and looking at, what does it say, Jill? Good examples of change, or market in the park in a variety of locations, events across the entire municipalities, like the Canada Day events. What challenges might limit our success? For interest rates for the developers and the municipality when we're taking on new projects, the speed of growth and matching the community's needs, NIMBYism, turning down applications that might match our municipal plans or policies, housing versus employment lands, and making sure that we're balancing that, the cost of living in the community and the gulf between higher and lower income earners, changing the provincial landscape. Comparison is the thief of joy, looking at neighboring municipalities versus pursuing well-planned development that meets our local context. And the fact that municipalities can really only use one form of of taxation and revenue generation, which is property taxes. So that can be a limiting factor. I hope this is what you're good with. Okay. What focus would you like to see for the future development? Is walkability, ensuring that new developments actually connect to existing community and create a cohesive sense of space. Growth or new recreation center to support recreation activities and development programs specifically for youth. An indoor soccer facility, partner with developers to make more affordable housing. We had no other priorities.
So I think then in order to try to keep on time, maybe if we go to the next group, so Councillor Prenger, were you the reporter? Maybe just if there are things that didn't touch on, so add to that. So if there are things that she didn't highlight and that are unique to your group, Okay, you can't remember everything.
No. Doesn't.
Thanks.
Okay.
I will,
Go ahead, Jennifer. I got it.
you can cut me off if I'm repeating. All right, so our group was Counselor Hinchberger and Counselor Steinhoff, Gray, and myself. What makes the municipality of Kincardine a unique and livable community? Our first thought was that there's multiple lifestyle options, including urban, rural, lakeside, village, living. You can choose whichever one you want. We have it all. Increasing diversity, of the proximity of our downtown to the lake and the fact that the highway doesn't run through our downtown. We have lots of land, so we have opportunities for development. So we have strong service groups to rely on in our community and a close-knit community. And we have that small town feel still, even though we're growing, so we're going to have to protect that. I'm going to be very dramatic. There we go. What opportunities should we be pursuing? Our number one was commercial, broad picture commercial, so including manufacturing, retail, food and hospitality. Number two for us to pursue is recreation for kids and to better leverage gathering spaces for everyone, including during the winter. To improve our public transportation. And to pursue an opportunity to potentially bypass Tiverton by collaborating with the MTO and the county, potentially through concession 11, so that as growth continues to occur in our community due to Bruce Power and people traveling in that direction or traveling, say, to Port Elgin and going north and farther, opportunities to take some of that traffic around Tiverton and protect those citizens rather than increasing the traffic through there. What challenges might limit our success? Thank you. That one was covered. Oh, old infrastructure being an inhibiting factor while we're trying to infill, specifically in Tiverton and some of the smaller hamlets. Availability of affordable and attainable housing. There's political risk due to a previous reputation for the municipality in the development industry. A potential in some areas we've gotten better apparently, but some lack of shovel-ready sites. And is that one? Okay. Sure. That one's good. Okay. What focus would we like to see? We'd like to focus on core commercial growth and more in Tiverton. And priorities that are not being addressed, that we'd like to see: education, potential for post-secondary education opportunities in the area, and transportation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And through the chair, this is the third group, which held Mayor Craig and myself. What makes Kincardine a unique and livable community? We had the blend of lakeside, world-class industrial capabilities and prime agricultural farmland, and the fact that they're all sort of unique and distinct. I also wanted to note that we enjoy a higher standard of living than many others due to those advantages. What opportunities should the municipality of Kincardine be pursuing? We should be looking to grow and expand the sectors we already have: energy, medical isotopes, in specifically their processing and transportation. We should focus on maintaining and growing our competitive advantages. If we have the population growth, other businesses will come because the workforce is available here. In terms of commercial and retail, we need to encourage stores to come. We need to educate and provide skills training for our youth as well as co-op opportunities. And then in terms of challenges that might limit our success, traditionally we've had an absence of vision. We've lacked a sense of ambition, and we're not as passionate as we needed to be about making ourselves what we need to be for the future coming. Too often we get distracted and don't focus on this goal, and we get sidetracked and go down other roads. The other point is finances, and we're not alone in this. Many other municipalities suffer from the same issue. We simply don't have the money and capital available to pay for the infrastructure and land acquisition that's needed for growth. And the final option is we need more people that want to work and pursue in this community. People that work and live in this community can't necessarily afford to live here. They're forced to live somewhere else and thus are spending their money in a different community when they could be spending where we are, right? The phrase we wrote down is shop local except for your house. What focus would you see for future development? Water infrastructure is the key one that I personally feel we need to highlight. We need to have a plan. We need to be shovel ready. We're fast approaching a point where we need to figure out which part of our water and wastewater infrastructure and servicing can be put out and where it's going to go. We need to eliminate the red tape and focus on acquiring the resources in terms of staff capacity as well to deal with what we want to do with development. And finally, the issues that are not being addressed that we'd like to see as well are land acquisition, housing supply, increasing supply, and repurposing existing municipal lands and assets, and then education for starting with high school and then expanding outward.
Thank you. The very last slide we have is just a comment or some points on some of the things that we are still currently working on. So we will be bringing forward some recommendations with respect to that research that we've been doing on municipal surplus lands and what kind of ideas we've come up with and what council could direct us to do with some of those ideas. There's also the comprehensive zoning bylaw review that is underway, and lots of staff effort currently underway in reviewing that. We have a question mark between the community improvement plan, just, question to council probably coming through in budget time as well about whether or not you want to be providing development incentives. So it's part of the work that's happening in economic development, but is this where council wants to go? As well as that housing reserve fund. How do you want to be using that? So these are questions we're going to be putting forward to council. And as the mayor mentioned, the desire is not to have this be a one and done conversation, but to have some additional workshops. We will let you talk perhaps longer next time as a group. But the idea being we carry this on so we're not only focused on individual council meetings where you're dealing with reports and decisions at the time, but bringing us back together so we're rowing in the same direction. Pass it over to you, Mayor.
Well, thank you for allowing me like 2 minutes to, oh, already too late. To council, thank you so much for investing this evening. The foundation that we're setting here is going to do our municipality well for a long time to come. Brock, thank you so much for being here to encourage and direct our thoughts a little bit. To Jack and Karina, thank you as well. Adam and Dwayne and Jenna over there, you did an awesome job as well. I think the folks will be here for a while for any conversations that you would like to continue on. And with that, thanks, and the meeting is over. No decisions tonight. You can't even vote on adjourning. Hey, Bill, what's up?
Through you, I don't want to waste this evening. There's a lot of great things that was brought to the table, and I don't think we have tied them off a little bit. And what I'd recommend is take all this information, maybe Lori and her staff can put it all together for us. And I'm thinking we need another workshop, probably a little more with just the council members talking about it, and maybe like for a month, because you're going to come with us or to us with some budget things. We need to discuss this and really get our strategy and really understand what we're going to use our land for. So maybe what we can do, Lori, I'm going to push you, try to put all this together, and let's have another meeting like this in October, if the council is agreeable to it. Thank you.